Okay, so welcome back. Yesterday I created the first video in this Take Better Photos course that I'm doing during the lockdown, and afterwards if we don't get finished in the next 17 days, I think it is. We looked at what makes a better photo. We looked at the rule of thirds, which does apply to pretty well all my photos. Leading lines, which is something I will use if it's there. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. So you can't always use leading lines, but as I say, take advantage of them if they do exist. Light and shadow, every single photo, yeah, pretty much every photo I take, I try and use light and shadow creatively. And as I explained, really dark shadows are fine, blown out highlights are fine in some photos. Sometimes I'll want the sky perfectly exposed and I'll have to use flash and that kind of stuff to get my subject correctly exposed. But most of the time I'm quite happy with really dark shadows and bright highlights. Depth. Layers in your photograph, we talked about that, and the composition, where we put all of those things together to create a better photograph. Well, that's the plan. Step 2, I said yesterday, I said I would do a video today about how to use your camera, and I've actually thought about that, and that's actually jumping ahead, I think, because we need to look at a couple of other things that means that when we look at your camera, things on your camera will make more sense than if I talked about them now. So we're going to talk about today the two things that are absolutely critical to getting a better photo are exposure and focus. If you take a photo and it's correctly exposed, and I'm not using the normal term for correctly exposed, I'm using my term for correctly exposed, which might be completely black shadows and blown out highlights, but is the exposure that you want, that you have decided, not the camera has decided, that you want. And focus. Again, not leaving that to the camera, deciding exactly what it is you want to focus on. Setting your camera up, which we will look at in the future, to be able to focus on exactly what you want to do on your subject. We're going to do that tomorrow. Today we're going to look at exposure. Excuse me. There are two aspects to exposure that I'm going to talk about. First is area. And the second is, how do you control the exposure to get this creative exposure that I talked about yesterday, and that we'll be looking at in future videos. We'll actually go out and I'll actually video myself taking some shots of certain things and how I'm setting the camera up to get those shots. We'll also look at then processing those, editing those in software. I use Lightroom. There are many free versions out there. Let me rephrase that. There are some free versions out there to look at how you can take a good photograph and turn it into something absolutely stunning. And that's a bit in the future. But you need to start out with the exposure that you want. So, focus area. Your camera has probably 3 settings to allow you to choose how the camera works out the correct exposure, and they will be I'm going to call it matrix. Different camera companies call it different things. I think Canon call it evaluative, Olympus might call it something else, and Panasonic might call it something else. Matrix, the whole screen. Okay, the camera looks at the whole scene as I think I mentioned yesterday, tries to adjust the exposure to get an average exposure. So if you imagine, I haven't really got room, but if you imagine that's your photograph, and you're taking a photograph of someone outdoors, and you've got sky here, really bright clouds, you've got a line of trees in the background, you've got your subject here, and you've got a really dark bush in this bit here. It's going to try and average all of that out. The usual result is that your subject, your person in this picture, ends up being either underexposed, which is the most common problem, or occasionally overexposed. That's not so often. But they're not correctly exposed if you use matrix metering, because the whole thing is being taken into account. The next will be center-weighted. And it's centre weighted, not centre, again, in most camera manufacturers. So it will look at the centre of the picture, and it will use that area disproportionately to the entire frame. So it won't take much notice of what's happening on the outside, but it will take a little bit of notice. So if you've got some really, really bright highlights, they are going to affect, even though it says centre weighted, really bright highlights outside will affect it, but it will bias the exposure calculations towards the centre, which, if you're using the rule of thirds and your subject is over here, isn't really going to be much help. Which is why on many, most DLSRs, you will find quite often people both focusing and exposing with their subject, hit either focus lock or exposure lock, and then recompose and then take the shot. You don't need to do that. We're going to look in a couple of videos time at how you don't need to do that. But in order for that to work, you need to use spot metering. Spot metering means on most cameras, pretty well every camera I've ever used, you can tie the spot exposure to the focus. So if you move the focus point to your subject, the camera will use that focus point, which is now on your subject, to calculate the exposure. And it will be quite a small area. It can be adjusted on some cameras from small, medium or large. You might have to play with that on your camera to get the right setting. But spot exposure, spot area, is going to be the right thing to use in almost every case, because then your subject is going to be correctly exposed. And that's what we're concerned with. Okay, so that's area. Obviously, as we get on to looking at the cameras and actually going out and practicing, we'll be talking about this more in detail. But that's the basics. Control. How do we control the exposure? Because we do have control over the exposure. It's not all down to the camera. We can change certain things which will hugely affect our photograph, and will also affect the exposure and other things. So let's have a look at those. I'm going to start with probably the least important these days. 10 years ago it might have been one of the more important aspects of these three, and that's ISO. The reason I say it's less important is ISO, what is it first? It's a measure of the sensitivity of the sensor in the camera to light. It's equivalent to, going back to the old film days, it's equivalent to the speed of the film. You used to buy 100, 200, 400 ISO films, the higher the number, the more sensitive the film is to light. So if you were going off to photograph a sporting event where, we'll come on to this in a second, you'll be using a fast shutter speed, you would choose a high ISO so that you could get the correct exposure with a high speed shutter. And it's exactly the same with the sensor. The ISO, it measures the sensitivity. The higher the number, the more sensitive the sensor is to light. Typically, and it used to, it would have been a problem 10 years ago, as I said, because cameras back then weren't very good at dealing with noise. Most cameras will start at 100 ISO, some go down to 50, and will go all the way up. My Nikon D800 goes to, I think it's 12,800. My Sony A7 goes to, I don't know, 250,000 or something like that, something crazy. But the higher this number, the more susceptible the photograph will be to noise. Noise is these tiny, tiny little specks of colour that you get on usually dark parts of the photograph. And when you zoom in, you get this kind of speckly look, okay? Personally, I don't find it a huge problem. In Lightroom later on, when we go through editing and processing, I actually add to some photographs something called grain to give them a more of a film look. A noise and grain, not too different, so I'm not too fast. It's not a huge deal. But if you went back 10 years ago, you'd be lucky to find a camera that would go anything above, well, 6,400 would be a very high ISO 10 years ago, and you would have a significant, and I mean significant, amount of noise at that level. You would normally, back then you would have had to stick to probably 1200 ISO, something like that. These days, as I say, it's not really a restriction, or much less of a restriction. So that, if you like, is the thing that I really don't worry about. We'll come on to that in a second. I'll come back to that. Next thing is speed. So that controls the sensitivity of the sensor to light. So obviously that affects the exposure. Speed, I think it's fairly obvious that if you've got the shutter and the camera open for half a second, it's going to get twice the amount of light onto the sensor as if it was a quarter of a second. And therefore speed hugely affects the amount of light getting onto the sensor and hence the exposure. So we can use speed to control the exposure. Aperture. Now some people, I think most people probably know what I'm talking about, but just in case, if I grab a lens, okay, I've got two lenses. I'm not sure that this is actually going to work because I'm not sure you can see this. I have no idea if you can see through that, but there is, this lens is at f16, I think, or might even be f24. But if you can see through that, there's a tiny, tiny hole through that lens. So that's the aperture. The gubbins, for want of a technical word, inside the lens has closed that hole down to make a really small hole, compared to this baby, where hopefully you can see that you've got about a 2-inch diameter hole right the way through the lens. So this is going to let in a huge amount more light because of the size of the aperture than the first one. So that is enormously variable, and aperture is the thing that will most affect our photograph. If we take a photograph with this lens, with a huge great aperture, and this is an f1.4 lens, we have a really shallow depth of field. Depth of field is the amount of what's in front of the camera in focus. So if I take a photograph here of something 5 feet away, the only part of that photograph that's going to be in focus will be a piece about that much, about ½ an inch will be in focus. The rest will start gradually to go out of focus. In fact, on that lens, quite quickly out of focus. If we go to f16, so the aperture is a lot smaller, then we've got a much deeper depth of field. And if I take a photograph here of the same thing 5-6 feet away, then we've now got probably that much in focus, and the rest of the scene will go out of focus, but much slower than if the aperture is 1.4. So we can change the look of the photograph hugely by playing with the aperture. Now obviously the aperture affects the amount of light getting onto the sensor, affects the exposure. So we can play around. So the way I take photographs is to set the aperture to give me the depth of field I want. The speed I then set. I don't set because we'll come on shortly. I use aperture priority. You've got exposure modes. I'm just digressing. I will be covering this in more depth. We've got exposure modes of aperture priority, program, shutter priority and manual, as well as probably auto and scene and something like that. But they're the 4 main exposure modes. I almost always use aperture priority, which gives me control of the most important thing. Speed, the camera works out itself to get the correct exposure. Same with ISO. If I put the settings on the camera so that the ISO is on auto, the camera will change the ISO settings to get the correct exposure. Speed, you do need to do a little bit of work with the speed, because the camera, if you're in a really dark situation, might want to drop the speed down to 1/10 of a second, 1/5 of a second. And there's a danger, it's 2 dangers. One is camera shake, because the speed is so slow. And the second is, unless you're photographing something inanimate, if you're photographing a person in 1/5 of a second, that person could move. And so you'll have a blurred photograph because they've moved, or you'll have an out of focus photograph because you've got camera shake. So we need to limit how slow the camera is going to go on the speed. That depends on the lens, on the focal length of the lens, but typically I'll use 1/160th of a second or 125th of a second, because that's going to take care of people moving. Unless it's actually a sports shot, but normally people, if I'm standing here and I'm moving at this sort of speed like this, I'm not standing still, 125th of a second will be sufficient to freeze my motion. If I was out running, doing gymnastics or crazy stuff that kids are doing something, that would probably want to be a 500th or even 1,000th of a second. But normal motion, 1/60th. And for most lenses, 1/160th of a second will be fast enough to stop camera shake. We'll talk more about that when we get onto the cameras. ISO I always leave on auto, so I've got full control of that, I've got partial control of that, and I really couldn't care less about ISO. That's the way I set my camera up. That's the way we'll be doing it when we get on to talking about the cameras. I think that covers it for today for exposure. As I say, as we go through, we'll be talking more about individual parts of this as we take some shots, as we go outside and play around with the camera. Hope you found that useful. Back, I say tomorrow, it might not be tomorrow, but the next video, possibly 2 days time, we're going to look at focus, because again we've got several options with focus. And the reason I'm talking about these two, if I haven't already said, is that if you get those two right, I think I did say at the beginning, you're going to get a good photograph. And that's your objective exercise. Back in the next video. Cheers for now. Look after yourself.